The morning sun painted the desert canyon in shades of gold and orange, as Ayana moved silently through her daily routine. She had lived alone in this hidden valley for 12 years now. Ever since her family was taken by the white soldiers, the canyon walls protected her like ancient guardians, and the small stream that ran through it provided everything she needed to survive. Ayana was 28 years old, with long black hair that caught the sunlight and dark eyes that held both wisdom and sadness. She had learned to live off the land completely, gathering wild plants, hunting small game with her bow, and fishing in the clear stream. Her small shelter was built into the rock face, invisible to anyone who might pass by the canyon rim above. Every morning she would climb to her lookout point high on the canyon wall. From there she could see for miles across the desert. It was her way of staying safe, watching for any signs of danger. For 12 years she had seen nothing but wildlife and the occasional lost traveler who never noticed her hidden valley below. The loneliness was her constant companion. She talked to the birds, sang old Apache songs her grandmother had taught her, and sometimes danced alone under the stars. She had made a life for herself, but deep in her heart, she longed for the sound of human voices, for the warmth of conversation, for the feeling of belonging to something larger than herself. She remembered her childhood clearly, the laughter around the fires, the stories the elders told, the feeling of safety when surrounded by her people. Her father had been a respected warrior, her mother a skilled healer. They had taught her everything she needed to survive, but they couldn't prepare her for the crushing weight of being completely alone. As she prepared her simple breakfast of roasted seeds and dried berries, Ayana noticed the wind had changed direction. It now came from the northeast, carrying scents that seemed different somehow. She paused, listening carefully to the sounds around her. The birds were singing their usual morning songs, but something felt different in the air. She decided to spend extra time at her lookout point today. Something in her bones told her that this day would not be like the others. As she climbed the familiar path up the canyon wall, she couldn't shake the feeling that her long years of solitude were about to come to an end. The view from the top was as beautiful as always. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by distant mountains and the occasional mesa. She settled into her usual watching spot and began her careful scan of the horizon. At first everything looked normal. Then far in the distance she saw something that made her heart race. Dust. A small cloud of dust moving slowly across the desert floor, heading in her direction. After 12 years of seeing nothing but wind-blown sand, this was definitely something else. Ayana strained her eyes, trying to make out what was causing the disturbance. As the minutes passed, the dust cloud grew larger and closer. Her hands trembled slightly as she realized what she was seeing. Riders. Several of them, moving together across the desert. Her first instinct was fear. Were these soldiers, settlers, people who might bring danger to her peaceful valley? She had stayed hidden for so long by avoiding all human contact, but as she watched longer, something about the way they moved seemed familiar. They rode low on their horses, moving with a fluid grace that reminded her of her own people. Her heart began to beat faster, not just with fear now, but with a wild hope she had buried years ago. Could they be Apache? Could there be others who had survived, who were still free? The possibility seemed too wonderful to believe, yet she couldn't tear her eyes away from the approaching riders. She decided to watch and wait, ready to hide if necessary, but hoping against hope that her long isolation might finally be coming to an end. As the riders drew closer, Ayana's experienced eyes confirmed what her heart had dared to hope. These were indeed Apache warriors, and they were in trouble. Their horses moved with the exhausted gait of animals pushed to their limits, and even from her distant perch, she could see the slumped postures of tired, possibly wounded men. She counted 7 riders, all men, their dark hair streaming behind them as they urged their horses forward. They kept looking back over their shoulders, clearly being pursued by someone or something. Ayana's mind raced as she tried to decide what to do. Her survival instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, to let them pass by without revealing her presence. But her heart pulled her toward these men who shared her blood and heritage. The lead rider was taller than the others, sitting straighter in his saddle despite obvious fatigue. Even tired and dusty, there was something commanding about his presence. His horse was a magnificent paint stallion, and he rode with the confident grace of a born leader. Something about him stirred feelings in Ayana that she had forgotten existed. As they drew nearer to her canyon, She realized they would pass right by the hidden entrance. This was her moment of decision. She could let them ride past and return to her solitary life, or she could reveal herself and offer help to her fellow Apache. The choice seemed impossible, but as she watched the exhausted group struggle forward, her decision was made. Ayana quickly climbed down from her lookout point and ran to the canyon entrance. Her heart pounded as she stepped out from behind the rocks that concealed her valley. The lead rider saw her first, and his hand immediately went to his weapon. But then he saw that she was Apache, and a woman, and his defensive posture relaxed slightly. The 7 men brought their horses to a halt, staring at her in amazement. They looked as shocked to see her as she felt to see them. The leader dismounted slowly, his dark eyes never leaving her face. He was even more impressive up close, with strong features and an air of natural authority that made her breath catch in her throat. "Sister," he said in their native language, his voice deep and warm despite his obvious exhaustion. "I am Dakota. We did not expect to find one of our people in this empty land." Ayana felt her knees go weak at the sound of her own language spoken by another person. It had been so long since she had heard those familiar words from anyone but herself. "I am Ayana," she replied, surprised at how rusty her voice sounded. "You are welcome here, brothers. I can see you are tired and in need of rest." The other warriors dismounted, and she could see that 2 of them were indeed wounded. One had a bandaged arm and another favored his left leg. They all looked as though they hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. Their clothes were dusty and torn, and their weapons showed signs of recent use. "We are being pursued by cavalry," Dakota explained, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon behind them. "We raided a supply convoy 3 days ago, and they have been following us ever since. We need water for our horses and a place to rest, but we cannot stay long." Ayana's heart went out to these brave men who were still fighting for their freedom, while she had been hiding like a frightened rabbit. Without hesitation, she gestured toward the hidden entrance to her canyon. "Come," she said. "You will be safe here. The cavalry will never find this place." As she led them into her secret valley, she was acutely aware of Dakota walking beside her. He was tall and strong, with calloused hands that spoke of years of hard living and fighting. There was a quiet intensity about him that drew her like a moth to flame. She found herself stealing glances at his profile, noting the proud set of his jaw and the way his long hair moved in the desert breeze. The other warriors exclaimed in amazement when they saw her hidden paradise. The green grass and clear water seemed like a miracle after days in the harsh desert. Their horses immediately headed for the stream, and the men began to relax for the first time in who knew how long. "This place is remarkable," Dakota said, turning to look at her with new respect. "You have built something special here, Ayana. How long have you lived alone in this valley?" 12 years, she replied, suddenly feeling self-conscious about her simple clothes and sun-darkened skin. "Since the soldiers took my family," something flickered in Dakota's eyes at her words. "Understanding, perhaps, or shared pain. We have all lost much to the white soldiers," he said quietly. "But you have survived, and that takes great strength." As the afternoon wore on, Ayana found herself drawn again and again to this mysterious leader who had appeared in her valley like a figure from a dream. Ayana busied herself preparing food for her unexpected guests, gathering wild onions, preparing dried meat, and collecting fresh water from the spring. Her hands moved automatically through these familiar tasks, but her mind kept drifting to the 7 men resting in her valley, especially their leader. She learned their names as the evening approached. Besides Dakota, there was Chaitan, a young warrior with fierce eyes and quick reflexes. Ahana was the group's tracker, able to read the desert like words on a page. Kemi was their best archer despite his wounded arm. Nalnish was barely 20, but already known for his courage in battle. Atuet served as their scout, and Iken was the eldest among them, a seasoned fighter with graying hair and countless battle scars. As she served them the simple meal she had prepared, Ayana noticed how they watched the canyon entrance nervously. These were men who had lived with danger for so long that even in this peaceful place, they couldn't fully relax. The only exception was Dakota, who seemed to trust her judgment about the safety of her hidden valley. "Tell us about this place," Dakota said as they ate. "How did you find it? And how have you stayed hidden for so long?" Ayana sat cross-legged beside the small fire, very aware of Dakota's presence next to her. "I was running from soldiers," she began, her voice growing stronger as she fell into the rhythm of storytelling. My family had been taken, our village destroyed. I rode for days without stopping, my horse dying beneath me just as I reached this area. She paused, remembering that terrible time. I was crawling across the desert, dying of thirst, when I found the entrance to this canyon. It was hidden behind fallen rocks, barely visible even up close. I thought I was hallucinating when I saw the green grass and heard the water running. The warriors listened intently, understanding the desperation that had driven her to this place. They had all experienced similar losses, similar desperate flights from overwhelming enemies. At first, I thought I would only stay until I was strong enough to find my people, she continued. But as the seasons passed, I realized this might be the safest place for me. The canyon walls hide smoke from above. The entrance is nearly impossible to see, and there's everything here I need to survive. Chaitan, the youngest of the group, shook his head in amazement. You lived here alone all this time. Weren't you afraid? Didn't you get lonely? Ayana smiled sadly. I was both afraid and lonely every day, but I was alive, and as long as I lived, part of our people lived too. Sometimes that seemed like enough. As the night grew darker, she found herself sitting closer to Dakota. There was something about him that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't experienced since childhood. When he spoke, the other men listened with obvious respect. When he moved, it was with the fluid grace of a natural warrior, and when he looked at her, she felt a stirring in her heart that she had thought was dead forever. We should reach the border mountains in 2 days if we push hard, Dakota was saying to his men. There are caves there where we can rest longer and plan our next move. What about Ayana? Asked Ahanu, the tracker. She can't stay here now that we've been through. If the cavalry is still following us, they might find this place. All eyes turned to her, and Ayana felt her world shifting beneath her feet. She had known this moment would come, but she hadn't expected it so soon. Her safe, hidden valley suddenly felt like a trap rather than a sanctuary. Dakota's dark eyes studied her face carefully. You could come with us, he said quietly. We could use someone with your survival skills, and you wouldn't have to be alone anymore. The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and danger. Ayana looked around at her valley, at the home she had built with her own hands, at the peace she had created from nothing. Then she looked at these 7 warriors who represented connection, adventure, and the chance to be part of something larger than herself again. I don't know if I remember how to be around people, she said honestly. I've been alone for so long. Dakota reached out and gently touched her hand. The contact sent lightning through her entire body. You'll remember, he said with quiet confidence. Some things are too deep in our hearts to forget. As the fire burned lower, casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls, Ayana made her decision. Tomorrow she would leave the only home she had known for 12 years and trust her future to these 7 strangers who were somehow also her family. But tonight, she would sit beside this remarkable man and feel her heart awakening from its long, lonely sleep. Dawn came too quickly for Ayana. She had barely slept, her mind racing with thoughts of leaving her valley and joining these warriors on their dangerous journey. She had spent the early morning hours gathering her few possessions and taking one last look at every corner of the place that had been her world for so long. Dakota found her sitting by the stream as the first. Light touched the canyon walls. He moved silently, but she sensed his presence before she saw him. There was something comforting about having him near, even though she had known him for less than a day. Having second thoughts? He asked, settling down beside her on the grass. Many of them, she admitted, watching the water flow over the smooth stones. This place has been my whole world. I know every plant, every rock, every shadow. Out there, she gestured toward the canyon entrance. Everything is unknown. Dakota was quiet for a moment, understanding her fear. Change is never easy, he said finally. But sometimes staying in one place, even a safe place, can be another kind of prison. His words struck deep into her heart. She had been safe in her valley, but had she been truly living? She thought of all the sunrises and sunsets she had watched alone, all the songs she had sung to empty air, all the conversations she had held with only her own echo for company. Tell me about your life before this, she said, wanting to know more about this man who was asking her to trust him with her future. Dakota's expression grew distant. I was a war chief of the Chiricahua band. We fought the army for years, trying to protect what was left of our homeland. But they were too many and we were too few. Most of our people were forced onto reservations or killed. These 6 men are all that's left of my band. The pain in his voice was unmistakable. Ayana reached out and touched his arm gently. "I'm sorry," she said. "To lose so much, to carry the weight of leading when everything seems hopeless, that must be very hard." He looked at her with surprise, as if he wasn't used to anyone understanding the burden he carried. "It is," he said simply. "But yesterday, when I saw you standing at the entrance to your valley, brave enough to help strangers despite your own safety, it reminded me that our people's spirit isn't dead as long as hearts like yours still beat." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. There was something building between them, something that had nothing to do with their shared heritage and everything to do with the connection she felt whenever he looked at her. The other warriors were beginning to stir, preparing for another day of hard travel. Kem's wounded arm was better after a night of rest, and even the horses seemed refreshed by the good water and grass. But Ayana could see the tension returning to their faces as they prepared to leave her safe valley. "How far to these mountains you spoke of?" she asked as she helped saddle the horses. 2 days of hard riding," Ahanu replied. "Maybe 3 if we have to take the long way around patrol areas." Chaitin, the youngest warrior, was obviously excited by the prospect of having a woman join their group. "Ayana, can you really shoot that bow as well as Dakota says you can?" She smiled at his enthusiasm. "I've had to feed myself for 12 years. I learned to shoot well, or I would have starved." "Show us," Nelnish challenged, pointing to a small bird perched on a branch across the stream. Without hesitation, Ayana drew her bow and released the arrow in one smooth motion. The arrow struck the branch just inches from the bird, close enough to prove her skill but far enough away that the bird flew off unharmed. The warriors whooped in appreciation, and even Dakota smiled with genuine admiration. "We'll be lucky to have you with us," he said, and the warmth in his voice made her cheeks flush. As they prepared to leave the valley, Ayana took one last look around. She had built a life here, found peace and safety, but she had also been slowly dying of loneliness. Now, riding beside Dakota as they emerged from the canyon into the bright desert morning, she felt more alive than she had in years. The sun was already hot, and the desert stretched endlessly before them. But for the first time in 12 years, Ayana wasn't facing it alone. She had companions, people who shared her blood and her struggles. And riding beside her was a man who made her heart beat faster every time he looked her way. As they rode across the open desert, Dakota stayed close beside her, sometimes pointing out landmarks or explaining their route. Every conversation drew them closer together, and Ayana found herself hoping that the 2 days to the mountains would pass slowly. But even as she enjoyed this new companionship, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Several times she caught herself looking back over her shoulder, scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. The 7 warriors were clearly experienced at being hunted, but now she was part of their dangerous world, and the safety of her hidden valley was far behind them. By midday, Ayana's fears proved justified. Ahanu, riding scout ahead of the group, came galloping back with news that chilled everyone's blood. "Cavalry," he reported tersely. "About 20 soldiers maybe a mile behind us and closing fast." Dakota's face hardened as he processed this information. "They must have picked up our trail from yesterday. We need to find cover or we'll be caught in the open." Ayana's heart pounded as she looked around at the barren landscape surrounding them. There were no trees, no rocks large enough to hide behind, nothing but endless stretches of sand and scrub brush. For the first time since leaving her valley, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. "There's a dry wash about 2 miles ahead," Kemi said, pointing northeast. "It might give us some cover." "We'll never make it," Chaitin said grimly, shading his eyes as he peered back across the desert. Look, in the distance a cloud of dust was visible and growing larger by the minute. The cavalry horses were fresh, while their own mounts were still tired from days of hard travel. It looked hopeless, but Dakota wasn't the kind of man who gave up easily. "I can take Nalnish and Chaitin, circle around to the south and try to draw some of them off. The rest of us will head for the wash. If we can split their forces, we might have a chance." The 3 warriors immediately split off from the group, riding hard toward the south in an attempt to divide the pursuing soldiers. Ayana found herself riding between Dakota and Ahanu, pushing her horse as hard as she dared toward the distant wash. "Can you handle yourself in a fight?" Dakota called to her over the thundering of hooves. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I've never had to." "Stay close to me," he commanded. "Whatever happens, don't try to be a hero. These soldiers are well-trained and well-armed. As they reached the dry wash, Ayana could see it wasn't much protection. The banks were only about 4 feet high, enough to crouch behind but not enough to hide the horses. Worse, she could now hear the sound of approaching hoofbeats, which meant the cavalry was very close. Dakota quickly surveyed their position. Ahanu, take the horses down into the wash and keep them quiet. Keme, find a spot where you can use that bow. Ayana, stay with the horses and be ready to run if this goes badly. I'm not hiding while you fight, she said firmly, surprising herself with her boldness. Dakota's eyes flashed with something that might have been admiration. Then stay low and only shoot if you have a clear target. Don't waste arrows. The first soldiers appeared on the horizon just as they took their positions. Ayana's mouth went dry as she saw how many there were. Even with 3 of their group trying to draw some away, they were still badly outnumbered. The cavalry approached cautiously, clearly aware that their quarry had gone to ground. Ayana could see their blue uniforms and the glint of sunlight on their weapons. Their leader was a tall man with a thick mustache who sat his horse with military precision. "Apache," the officer called out. "We know you're in that wash. Come out with your hands up and you won't be harmed." Dakota's laugh was bitter. "We've heard those promises before, soldier. This is your last chance," the officer shouted back. "Surrender now or we'll come in after you." The silence that followed was broken only by the snorting of horses and the whisper of wind across the desert. Ayana could feel her heart hammering against her ribs as she gripped her bow. Beside her, Dakota checked his rifle one more time, his face calm despite the impossible odds they faced. Then the attack came all at once. The soldiers charged toward the wash from 3 directions, their war cries echoing across the desert. Dakota's rifle barked and one of the blue uniformed figures tumbled from his horse. Keme's bow sang and another soldier fell, but there were too many of them. Ayana found herself shooting arrow after arrow, amazed at how steady her hands remained despite her fear. She watched Dakota fighting like a man possessed, his rifle empty now, using it as a club as soldiers closed in around him. Everything happened so fast that afterward she could never remember all the details clearly. She remembered the sound of gunfire, the smell of powder smoke, the sight of Dakota going down under the weight of 2 soldiers. Without thinking, she leaped up from cover and rushed toward him, her knife in her hand. The soldier raising his pistol to finish Dakota never saw her coming. Her blade found the gap between his ribs and he collapsed with a surprised gasp. The second soldier turned toward her, but Dakota was already moving, striking upward with his own knife. For a moment, everything was chaos. Then suddenly, unexpectedly, they heard gunfire from the south and the sound of the cavalry bugle calling retreat. Aikin Nalnish. And Chaitin had apparently found reinforcements or created enough confusion to convince the commanding officer that he was facing a larger force than expected. As the dust settled and the soldiers retreated, Ayana found herself kneeling beside Dakota in the sand. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead and breathing hard, but he was alive. More importantly, he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen before. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "You would have done the same for me," she replied, though her hands were shaking now that the danger had passed. As they tended their wounds and waited for the other 3 warriors to return, Ayana realized that something fundamental had changed between her and Dakota. They had fought together, bled together, and depended on each other for survival. The bond growing between them had been tested by fire and proven strong. The 3 warriors returned just before sunset, grinning with the satisfaction of a successful diversion. They had managed to lead half the cavalry patrol on a wild chase through a maze of canyons before losing them completely. The remaining soldiers, thinking they were outnumbered, had retreated to regroup. "We should reach the mountain caves by tomorrow evening," Aiken reported as they made camp in the shelter of the wash. "But we'll need to be careful. That patrol will be back with reinforcements." As they sat around their small, carefully hidden fire, Ayana became aware of how the dynamics of the group had changed. The warriors now looked at her differently, with the respect reserved for someone who had proven herself in battle. More importantly, she noticed how Dakota's eyes followed her every movement. "You fought well today," Keme said, nodding toward her with approval. "That soldier never knew what hit him." "I didn't think," she replied honestly. "I just saw Dakota in danger and acted." Chaitin grinned. "The best warriors don't think in battle. They just react with their hearts." But it was Dakota's quiet thank you that made her pulse quicken. There was something in his voice, something deeper than gratitude for saving his life. When their eyes met across the fire, she felt that familiar stirring in her chest that had nothing to do with the fight they had survived. Later, when the others had settled down to sleep, Dakota approached her where she sat keeping first watch. The desert was beautiful under the starlight, peaceful in a way that seemed impossible after the violence of the afternoon. "Can't sleep?" he asked, settling down beside her. "Too much to think about," she replied. "A few days ago, my biggest worry was whether the rabbits would avoid my snares. Now I'm running from cavalry and fighting for my life." Dakota was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the moonlight. "Do you regret leaving your valley?" Ayanna considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "I was safe there, but I wasn't really living. Today, when I thought you might die, I realized that being safe isn't the same as being alive. And what makes you feel alive?" His voice was soft, intimate in the darkness. She turned to look at him, her heart racing at what she saw in his eyes. "This," she whispered. "Being here with you and the others. Having people who depend on me and people I can depend on. Fighting for something that matters." Dakota reached out and gently touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "You're remarkable, Ayanna. I've known warriors who wouldn't have done what you did today." The tenderness in his voice made her breath catch. "I couldn't let anything happen to you," she said, the words coming out more revealing than she had intended. "Why?" he asked, though something in his expression suggested he already knew the answer. Instead of replying with words, she leaned forward and kissed him softly. It was the first kiss she had shared with anyone in 12 years, and it felt like coming back to life after a long, dreamless sleep. When they broke apart, Dakota's arms came around her, holding her close against his chest. "I never expected to find you," he murmured against her hair. "In all this emptiness and danger, I never imagined there could be someone like you." They held each other under the stars, two souls who had found each other against impossible odds. For Ayanna, it felt like the missing piece of herself had finally been restored. She had been alone for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to be part of something larger, to care about someone else's welfare more than her own. "What happens when we reach the mountains?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to think beyond this perfect moment. "We rest, we plan, we figure out our next move," Dakota replied. "But whatever happens, we face it together." The promise in his words filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. After 12 years of solitude, she finally had a future that included other people, a purpose beyond mere survival, and most amazingly of all, a man who looked at her as if she were the answer to prayers he had forgotten he was praying. As the night wore on and the others slept peacefully around them, Ayanna and Dakota talked quietly about their pasts, their hopes, and the uncertain future they would face together. She learned that he had lost his wife and children to soldiers 3 years earlier, and had been carrying that grief like a stone in his chest ever since. "I thought my heart was dead," he told her, as the first hint of dawn appeared on the horizon. "But being with you, seeing your courage and strength, it's like watching the sun rise after the longest night." When Ahanu woke to take the next watch, he found them still sitting close together, her head resting on Dakota's shoulder as they watched the desert come alive with the new day. The tracker smiled knowingly but said nothing, understanding that something precious and rare had bloomed in the darkness. As they prepared to resume their journey toward the mountains, Ayanna felt a sense of anticipation she hadn't experienced in years. The future was uncertain and probably dangerous, but she would face it with these brave men beside her, and with Dakota's love growing stronger in her heart with each passing moment. The mountain caves were everything Dakota had promised and more. Hidden high in the rocky cliffs, they were invisible from below and provided perfect shelter from both the elements and pursuing enemies. A natural spring bubbled up from deep within the mountain, and the caves were large enough to house many more people than their small group. As they settled into their new temporary home, Ayanna marveled at how her life had transformed in just a few short days. Instead of talking to herself in an empty valley, she was surrounded by the comfortable sounds of human companionship. The warriors joked with each other, shared stories of past adventures, and gradually began to include her in their easy camaraderie. But it was her growing relationship with Dakota that filled her days with joy and anticipation. He sought her out constantly, finding excuses to walk with her when she gathered plants for cooking, asking her opinion on plans for their future, and simply sitting beside her in comfortable silence as they watched the sunset paint the mountains in brilliant colors. 3 weeks after their arrival, as they sat together on a rocky ledge overlooking the vast desert below, Dakota took her hand in his and asked the question she had been hoping to hear. "Ayanna, will you be my wife?" The words hung in the clear mountain air like a prayer. She looked into his dark eyes and saw her future reflected there. A future filled with love, adventure, and the deep satisfaction of belonging somewhere again. "Yes," she whispered, her heart so full she could barely speak. The wedding ceremony was simple but beautiful, conducted according to the old Apache traditions under the stars with the 6 warriors as witnesses. Ahanu had found eagle feathers, and Kimi presented her with a necklace of turquoise he had been carrying since childhood. Even Chaitan, usually so serious about matters of war and survival, spent the day weaving wildflowers into a crown for her hair. As they spoke their vows in the ancient language of their people, Ayanna felt the presence of all the ancestors who had gone before them. Her parents, Dakota's lost family, all the Apache who had died fighting for freedom were somehow present in that sacred moment, blessing their union and the new life they were creating together. The months that followed were the happiest of Ayanna's life. Their mountain stronghold became a refuge for other Apache who had escaped the reservations or were fleeing from the army. Word spread through the hidden networks that still connected their scattered people that there was a place where Apache could live free, where the old ways were honored and practiced. Dakota proved to be not just a skilled war leader but a wise chief who knew when to fight and when to negotiate. Under his leadership, their small band grew into a thriving community of nearly 50 people. Men, women, and children arrived throughout the spring and summer, all seeking the freedom that seemed impossible to find anywhere else. Ayanna discovered talents she never knew she possessed. The skills she had learned during her years of solitude made her invaluable to the growing community. She taught the other women about the edible plants of the region, showed them how to find water in seemingly barren areas, and shared the survival techniques that had kept her alive for 12 years. More importantly, she became the heart of their little society. Her gentle wisdom helped settle disputes. Her laughter brightened the darkest moments, and her unwavering faith in their cause inspired everyone around her. The children especially loved her, gathering around her fire in the evenings to hear stories of the old days when the Apache roamed free across all the southwestern lands. But their peaceful existence couldn't last forever. As autumn approached, army patrols began appearing more frequently in the valleys below their mountain refuge. It became clear that someone had informed the military about their location, and it was only a matter of time before a serious attempt would be made to force them out. "We have 2 choices," Dakota announced at a council meeting one crisp October evening. "We can scatter again, go back to living as small bands hiding in the desert, or we can make our stand here and fight for our right to live free." The debate that followed was intense, but respectful. Some argued for scattering, pointing out that their women and children would be safer if the group broke up. Others insisted that running would only postpone the inevitable confrontation. Ayanna listened to all the arguments before standing to speak. The cave fell silent as everyone turned to hear what the woman who had become their unofficial spiritual leader would say. "I spent 12 years hiding," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the cavern. "I was safe, but I was not free. Safety without freedom is just another kind of death. If we scatter now, we will spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, never able to build anything lasting, never able to give our children a true home." She paused, looking around at the faces illuminated by firelight. "I say we stand and fight. Not because we love war, but because we love freedom more than we fear death. And if we must die, let us die as free Apache on our own land." The vote was unanimous. They would make their stand in the mountains. The final battle came 3 weeks later, just as the first snow began to fall on the high peaks. The army arrived with over 200 soldiers, artillery pieces, and orders to capture or kill every Apache in the mountains. But they found a people prepared to fight for everything they held dear. The battle raged for 3 days. Ayanna fought beside her husband, her bow singing as arrow after arrow found its mark. She watched Chaitan lead a desperate charge against an artillery position, saw Kame fall defending the path to the women and children, and held Nalnish as he died from wounds received protecting their water supply. But they held. Against overwhelming odds, through determination, superior knowledge of the terrain, and the desperate courage of people fighting for their freedom, they held their mountain refuge. On the fourth day, as snow began to fall more heavily, a white flag appeared among the army positions. The commanding officer wanted to negotiate. The terms offered were simple. The Apache could remain in their mountains, but they would be considered a sovereign nation with the right to govern themselves according to their own laws. In exchange, they would agree to stop raiding supply trains and settlements, and would serve as scouts for the army against hostile tribes. It wasn't everything they had hoped for, but it was more than anyone had dared dream. For the first time in decades, a group of Apache would be allowed to live free on their own land. As spring returned to the mountains, Ayanna stood once again on the rocky ledge where Dakota had proposed to her. But now she wasn't alone. Her husband stood beside her, and in her arms was their newborn son, the first child born free in the Apache mountain refuge. Looking out over the vast desert that had once seemed so empty and hostile, Ayanna smiled. She had traveled far from the frightened woman hiding in a secret valley. Through love, courage, and the unbreakable bonds of family and community, she had found not just a new life, but a new hope for her people's future. The 7 warriors who had arrived seeking refuge had found something far more valuable than temporary shelter. They had found a new beginning, a place where the Apache spirit could flourish again, and a woman whose love had helped transform them from fugitives into the founders of something beautiful and lasting. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, 3 generations of Apache children played in the caves behind them, their laughter echoing off the ancient stones like a promise that freedom, once won, would never be surrendered again.